Hey, what's up? I'm ToaSniper98, but you can just call me 2. Honkai Star Rail is coming out soon on the 26th, and so far it's looking like Genshin 1.5, or if you want to be generous about it, Genshin 2.0. Not only that, but Wuthering Waves should also be having its first public closed beta starting on the 24th, or at least I think it's its first public CBT, and apparently people are already playing it anyway. And I'm expecting to hear more news from Arknight's Enfield later this year, which means that Genshin's got some potential competition on the horizon. No, I don't count Tower of Fantasy. So that got me to do this video, in which I tell you all the ways in which I would improve Genshin Impact. Let me hit you with some disclaimers first. As you can see on the screen, I play quite a few gacha games, 7 of them in fact, 8 if we count Star Rail, which I plan to get into pretty heavily once it's out, and even more later down the line when other games come out too. Now, to some of you who also play a lot of gachas at once, that might not sound all that impressive until you realize that when I say I main all of them, I mean it. The reason why I bring this up, other than to show you my crippling addiction to hot anime girls with huge tits, is because playing all sorts of different gachas at the level that I do gives me lots of perspective on how they can all be improved, which is something that not a lot of other people have, especially in the Genshin community, where I think it's safe to say that Genshin is a lot of people's very first and possibly only gacha game. So I'm going to be pulling in ideas from these other gachas that I think are relevant to the problems that I think Genshin has wherever appropriate. Some of you may not like this either because you feel like I'm not coming up with any of my own original ideas, or because you think Genshin should do its own thing and not have to take cues from other gachas. But remember that Genshin has done events before that feature gameplay that's arguably taken from other games and, definitely not indicative of its own. That, and allow me to point out that games taking ideas and concepts that work from other games in the same genre is very commonplace, and that certainly isn't limited to just gachas. So unless you come up with something totally original, you're always going to be recycling some idea that was already used before in a previous title, and Genshin is far from being completely original, so it's just par for the course. And lastly, I will sound like I'm ranting at certain points throughout the video, and I'll be talking some shit directly about MiHoYo too. Don't take them seriously. At the end of the day, I still think Genshin is a great game, and MiHoYo a great developer and publisher, just that Genshin could use some serious improvements that I do hope MiHoYo will consider putting into the game at some point, and obviously they don't need to listen to me in particular and what I have to say in this video when they do. With that, let's get into it. Let's start with some exploration related suggestions, specifically the portable teleporter. Increase the portable waypoint cap to something like 10 or more, maybe even 20, and having them last longer than a week, at least 2 weeks, maybe even 3. Portable waypoints are exactly what they sound like, custom teleporters that you can make at the crafting table and then place anywhere on the map, though you have to physically be in the spot where you want to place one first. The main problem is that you can only have one active at any time. Back in the first year of the game, this wasn't nearly as big of an issue since the map was naturally a lot smaller back then. But, 2.5 years later, we have 2 more regions, a lot more points of interest, and a hell of a lot more rock locations to mine for weapon crystals, and so there are a lot more places where having custom teleporters set up would come in very handy. Other issues with custom teleporters is that they only last a week at a time, and since you can only have one up at a time, setting another one down will destroy the previous teleporter if there was one active already. So increasing the number you can have active at the same time and making them last longer will make them more useful. Increase the map marker cap from 150 to 250 or higher. Map markers are, again, what they sound like, little markers that you can put on your map to remind you why that location that you just marked is important, and you can customize the markers with specific symbols and labels even to better understand each one. Like the teleporter issues earlier, the map has gotten significantly bigger since year 1, and so there are a lot more points of interest to remember. For example, I make regular rock farming runs to stock up on ores to make the daily 30 weapon crystals, but with all the new rock spawns in Sumeru, in addition to the ones we already had from previous regions, the current 150 marker cap isn't quite enough, and while I remember where most rocks are on the map, I'm bound to miss a few here and there. So increasing the map marker count would alleviate this issue. I believe MiHoYo has already increased the marker count in the past once before, so hopefully they increase it again in the future. Improve and expand Wing Glider mechanics. The Wing Glider is the device your character uses to glide around when jumping off a cliff or other elevated positions, so that way you don't plunge to your death like the average Zhao main. One area in which I've always felt Genshin's exploration was always a little lacking was aerial exploration. Sure, each region has its own aerial exploration quirk. Mondstadt has those anemo particles that turn into an updraft when you gather 3 of them. Liyue has the invisible updrafts that activate when you pass through them while gliding. Inazuma has the electro tethers that lets you zip along them really fast, and same with Sumeru with their own tether points. But these are regional specific quirks, and they aren't everywhere, so if you want to get somewhere where there are none of these things, especially if you're trying to go up, it can take you a little bit to get there, and your Wing Glider doesn't have a way to propel itself or travel upwards at all, mainly because miHoYo gave that mechanic to specific characters like Venti, Kazuha, and most recently Wanderer. And if you need to glide somewhere far away, well, I hope you pick a scenic route, because you'll be doing nothing but looking at all the pretty sights while holding forward for however many minutes it'll take to get there. Ideally, I'd like to see the Wing Glider get some upgrades that allow for at least some vertical movement and increased gliding movement as well. I'm aware that there exist items and character passives that can affect gliding stamina and speed, but you have to have that item equipped and that character in your party, and well, if you don't have them, you're just shit out of luck. My hopium is that because at the time of this video recording, Fontaine is our next major region, and it's supposed to be a technologically advanced steampunkish region, or at least so I hear, this will provide the lore reason to give the Wing Glider those upgrades that I'm hoping for, but I could be wrong about that. And if not, then at the very least, I'd like to see the stamina consumption for gliding removed, since I've always thought it was kind of ridiculous that a separate device like a Wing Glider takes stamina to use. And a minor gripe that I have personally, because your character physically turns in the direction that you want them to go while gliding, sometimes if you try to turn them at a very sharp angle, your character can start rotating in an awkward direction, and you find yourself having to spend a moment or two correcting their course. This could just be a skill issue, but what I think would fix this is simply making characters turn around faster while they're gliding. Add new universal movement mechanics to streamline the exploration process. Admittedly, this isn't something that's likely to happen, but then again, a lot of suggestions that I'm going to make in this video aren't likely to happen either, so I might as well shoot my shot here. The movement that's available to all characters in Genshin is pretty basic. They can walk, run, dash, sprint, jump, and dash jump, I guess. This is again that same issue where this wasn't a concern during the first year of the game because the game was new and there were only 2 regions to explore back then, both of which are a lot simpler in terms of exploration compared to the following 2 we've gotten in the years since. But now that we have the desert portions of Sumeru being larger than the entirety of Liyue, traveling around becomes less of a spectacle and more of a chore sometimes, especially 2 years in, where a lot of veteran players by now are kind of over the whole exploration aspect of the game because the novelty's worn off. This is something I don't have a clear answer for. The most I can suggest is something like what Wuthering Waves featured in some of their recent closed beta footage, where characters can scale short vertical distances quickly, implying that there's some sort of wall running mechanic that lets you conveniently traverse up cliff sides and stuff like that. That and the existence of certain characters who have enhanced movement options like Yelan and Sayu, whose skills cover lots of horizontal ground at no stamina cost, Wanderer who turns Genshin into a frickin' Dragon Ball Z game by flying around all over the place like a Saiyan, Kazuha, Venti, and Wanderer again, who, as I mentioned earlier, have skills that give them vertical coverage, and Kazuha even having a passive that reduces sprint stamina cost for his party, Dehia's and Rosaria's day and night specific movement speed buffs respectively, and Mona's and Ayaka's alternate sprint that allows them to travel over water, tells me that miHoYo would rather implement characters with more varied movement options rather than expand the base movement set for all characters in the game. So in keeping with this sort of design philosophy, miHoYo just needs to add more characters with their own unique movements, so that way players will have more chances to have characters who can help out with exploration. Though to be fair, this is something they'll probably do anyway without me having to talk about it. Next are some gameplay related improvement suggestions, starting with what's probably going to be the most controversial one that I'm going to list here. I would like to see the addition of a second skill for every character in the game. To clarify, I'm not advocating for characters to have access to both skills at the same time, since that'll mess with the controls that people are used to. For example, on PC, like where would you bind the second skill to? Like maybe the R key? but people who play archers, specifically archers who rely on like normal or charge shots like Yoimi or Ganyu, can't do that. So while I think second skills would be great, I still think that characters should only have access to one skill at a time, but you can toggle which one a character is using whenever you're not in combat. This inclusion of a second skill for everyone means that characters who have incomplete, flawed, or just not very strong kits have a chance to rectify the problems that they have, and characters who already have complete or strong kits may get an alternate playstyle or tool that can open up more diverse teams or make the teams that they already enable even stronger. I would go so far as to suggest that every character also get a second ult, but even I think that'd be asking for way too much when a second skill would already drastically increase MiHoYo's workload for their character design process, since they'd be looking at not only giving a second skill to like 30 or 40 characters or however many there are in the game at this point, but also making sure that character passives also synergize with whatever their second skills would be. At the same time though, the sooner they do this the better, since the longer they take to come out with second skills, if they ever will of course, the more characters that there will be in the game by that point, and the more characters they'd have to backtrack to give those second skills to. Add characters who can multi-class into different weapon types. What I mean by this is, I'd like to see a character in Genshin who can equip two different weapon types, like a sword or a spear for example. And I'm not talking about characters like Tartaglia, Raiden, or Mika who do use different weapons depending on what they're doing, but still only have one equipable weapon slot at the end of the day. I'm talking about a character who can put two weapons from entirely different categories to use, though obviously just one at a time still. This is going to be more complicated than giving characters second skills in contrast, since having different weapon types implies having different capabilities, especially if a character could use both a ranged weapon, like a bow or catalyst, and a melee weapon, like a sword, claymore, or a spear. So, because of the added complexity of making characters like this, I don't think that there should be too many characters like them, just a few to spice things up every now and then. Add more characters who put their own unique spins on the elemental reaction system. The standout example we have of this is Nilo, because she has a passive that's dedicated to changing the way the bloom reaction works. A standard bloom reaction produces a pod that sits on the ground for a little bit before detonating and dealing AoE dendro damage. The main drawback of these bloom teams is that those pods that they make take a while to go off, and bloom teams themselves are gateways into hyper bloom teams, which are better. So there's no real incentive to run standard bloom unless you just don't have a suitable electro character yet. But Nilo's passive specifically buffs that dendro pod when she's the one triggering bloom, and causes it to explode faster and deal more damage. The game even calls those pods that Nilo creates by a different name, bountiful cores if I'm remembering it right. This removes the main downside of regular bloom teams and makes super bloom teams, as I like to call them, behave almost like hyper bloom teams, just without an electro character, so that frees up your Raiden or Cookie to be a part of your other Abyss team. So I'd like to see more characters who do what Nilo does to bloom, interesting twists on existing elemental reactions that open up more team variety and possibilities, and I'd say this is becoming more relevant now that people are increasingly realizing that Geo is the forgotten element these days, especially now that Envy's pointed out the fact that with 3.7, we'll have more Dendro characters than Geo. And since I don't think MiHoYo is going to make any overhauls to the existing elemental reaction system, the most likely thing they'll do is add more characters who mess with the reactions in their own unique ways, like what Nilo does for bloom teams, which means a Geo character, for example, who changes how Crystallize works could make Geo great again. Add new weapon classes or subclasses into the game. Almost 2.5 years in, Genshin still has the base 5 weapon types that it had at launch: sword, claymore, spear, catalyst, and bow. So I think it's about time that we got a 6th weapon type to mix things up. For my choice, it would be firearms, and it also shouldn't surprise you to know that I'm American. Stereotypes aside though, the inclusion of firearms would balance the number of melee weapons against ranged weapons, and we know that guns do exist in Genshin lore since, well, the Fatui use them with their pyro gunners, cryo gunners, and hydra gunners. So we could get a gunslinger archetype that plays at range like catalyst users do. 2 other weapon class suggestions that I have are knives and straight up fisticuffs, though to be fair, I don't think we'll have a dedicated brawler archetype since we already have characters like Heizo and Dehyo Nokia who run around punching people in the face already. And I'm sure there are other weapon types out there that could qualify that I can't think of that could make it into Genshin. For weapon subtypes, I'm thinking of things like maces for sword users, scythes, halberds, or battle axes for spear users, and crossbows for bow users, though honestly they'd probably be a more appropriate subclass for gun users instead. Technically, we kind of have something like this already. For example, the halberd is an actual 3-star weapon that spear users can equip, but it's just a visual difference compared to all the other spears in the game. Basically, I'd like to see a meaningful expansion to weapon classes where you have weapons that perform as the class originally intended, and then you have some weapons that branch out into different specialties to put a little twist on that class. I mentioned making maces as a subclass of the sword. Maybe they can have a chance to stagger enemies like claymores can, or even stun them for a second, with crits because of the blunt force. Scythes could have bonus damage against shields, for example, to break them faster, and have a chance to insta-kill smaller enemies if they're below like 10% or 20% of their max HP, and that way that would generate more energy particles like the Favonius Lance. You get the idea. Introduce a way to buff older or weaker characters, which is something that I mentioned earlier. Some characters in Genshin are considered weaker than others, and Twitter will gladly tell you which ones exactly, but simply buffing them like they did with Zhongli back in the day is kinda boring, and you can easily turn this into content, so there's a few ways MiHoYo can implement their own buff system, so to speak. Since characters have their own story quests, they could implement buffs for them as another one of their story chapters, and in order to receive that buff for that character, you need to complete the appropriate chapter for them. For example, Fate Grand Order handles some of their buffs this way by including interlude chapters for certain characters that buff them when completed. Characters could receive an additional unique equipment slot, and by completing certain quests or spending materials, they can gain a unique piece of gear that buffs them in some way that they can equip or unequip at will. This is how Arknights does it with their module system, and to a certain extent, Blue Archive as well, with character unique equipment. That's literally what it's called there. Or characters can go through a process that costs materials, but in exchange gives them a full makeover by giving them not only buffs, but also a new skin, voice lines, and animations, which is what Girls Frontline does with their Mod 3 system. If character buffs are marketed and handled this way, then it can easily be content that the player base can look forward to. The problem is that currently besides Zhongli, there's no precedent for MiHoYo ever doing this outside of like stealth buffs to characters right before they were released, as what happened with Ganyu, or at least that's what I heard. So hopefully MiHoYo does have plans to eventually implement something like this in the future. Now, time for the category with the bulk of the suggestions in this video: overall content. This pertains to anything that has to do with how the game functions, or anything gameplay related that isn't about direct combat or combat mechanics. You'll see what I mean when I get into it. The first elephant in the room: add a story dialogue skip button. This should be self-explanatory, but let me elaborate on why it's important anyway. It respects the player's choice. In all of the gacha games that I have ever played, with only one exception, and I think you can guess which one that is, a skip function lets you bypass almost any story-related text to smoothly transition in and out of the actual gameplay. There's a few reasons why people want to skip the story in gacha games. They might not physically have the time to read all of it because of, real life, or even if they do, they'd rather spend their time actually playing the game and then go do something else afterwards. They might not like the story in a game for whatever reason, so they can't be bothered to read it, or they might not care for gacha game stories in general. Or they might have forgotten or neglected to do an event, and so they need to rush to finish it, and skipping the story saves them precious time. In other words, a story skip button would respect all these choices that players want to make and allow them to play the game as they see fit. So to me, the fact that Genshin doesn't have one and hasn't had one for the past 2.5 years is a deliberate choice made by MiHoYo. Now, to be fair, Genshin cutscenes usually, and I emphasize usually, aren't that long, and so just spamming left click through them is, usually a suitable solution. And because Genshin is a 3D open world RPG game, it has an advantage over almost all other gacha games in that it doesn't read out like a visual novel like they do. You can physically see a scene play out with characters rendered in 3D models so that it's easier to take in instead of having to try to imagine what's going on in your head with only, static images and still backgrounds to help you out. But these things don't justify the fact that MiHoYo is essentially forcing players to play the game in the way that they want you to play it, even if it's something as seemingly trivial as, skipping a story cutscene. To put this in perspective, consider this. The main character, the Traveler, is a sword user who's the only one in the game who has access to multiple elements and can change what element they use at any time at a region statue of 7. You, as the player, have the choice to decide which element you want your Traveler to be, in addition to what weapon you want them to use as long as it's a sword. You have agency that gives you the power to decide how you want to play as the Traveler. You can give them the best possible artifacts and weapon and play them as optimally in their chosen element as possible, or you can just refuse to replace the dull sword that you started the game with because that would be more accurate to the lore. And yeah, sure, if your Traveler still has a level 1 dull sword and they're still stuck on Anemo even after 2.5 years, they're not going to be hitting as hard as someone else's DMC with an R5 Jade Cutter. But the important thing is that the game allows you to do this in the first place, no matter what your reason might be, meaning that MiHoYo consciously made the decision to give players this type of freedom, the freedom to play the game in vastly different ways, even if not all of them are what we'd consider to be optimal. But when it comes to the story, suddenly you have no freedom, because once you trigger a cutscene in Genshin, there is no choice to be made. You're watching this damn cutscene whether you want to or not. If it's one of those, custom animated scenes rendered at 30 FPS for the true cinematic experience, then that's fine since they're at least fun to watch, but those are rare since MiHoYo has to animate them themselves as opposed to just, using stock movement and actions to put a cutscene together like they do with the vast majority of Genshin story dialogue. And it's not like they've improved those stock animations much in the last 2 years either. Personally, the lack of a skip button conveys to me that MiHoYo wants to use the story as another way to keep players playing Genshin, because if they're invested into the story, then they're more likely to keep playing the game to see what happens in the story next in future updates. I mean, hell, Arknights and Blue Archive even give you a quick chapter synopsis when you skip story stuff, so that way you can still get the gist of what's going on. If Genshin's story were on par with those, then I wouldn't mind following it a little more closely, but if that were the case, then MiHoYo shouldn't even feel like they need to force their players to follow the story by removing the skip button, because the quality of the story itself should be what compels people to want to read it in the first place. And even then, there will always be people out there who still won't give a crap about the plot. No, not that kind, the normal kind, no matter how well written it is. What's even more hilarious is that MiHoYo has other games that it manages besides Genshin, and most of them have skip buttons of their own, with the possible exception of Star Rail, which isn't surprising given that it's basically Genshin 2.0. Expand the Traveler's spoken dialogue. This is another minor gripe, but I'd also like to hear the Traveler's voice a little more often. Hey, if MiHoYo is gonna force me to sit my ass through all the dialogue in the game, they can at least, let me listen to Lumen more often. And I know that they have a set of voiced lines already in their individual profiles, but you're not gonna go in there every 5 seconds just to listen to another voice line from them, I actually wouldn't have brought this up if they had stayed true to the whole silent protagonist archetype that the Traveler is supposed to be, and for much of the first half of the story they were, outside of the dialogue choices you have to make sometimes. But more often these days, you can find scenes where the Traveler is very clearly thinking to themselves, and it's not even during a dialogue choice, such as during Carabert's Archon quest during 3.5. I'm aware that they're not technically speaking out loud, so because of that they don't need to be voiced, but it just feels a little disingenuous to me. Typically in gacha games, the main character of the story is supposed to be you, the player, because games want to make you feel like you're directly involved and affecting the story via the silent protagonist archetype. And to that end, games deliberately keep your appearance and identity hidden for additional immersion. And if they ever do show you what you look like as the main character, it'll usually be a very ambiguous image of a very heavily dressed individual with a face covered so that you can't tell if they're a guy or a girl. So leaving you, the main character, without a voice in-game makes sense. But that's not what Genshin does. From the very beginning, you know what the main character looks like. They have their own identity, their own story, and their own goals and ambitions. In other words, they're their own character. So the Traveler could never be a representation of you, the player. The most it could be was a mostly silent protagonist who only speaks a few lines to give some scenes extra weight and silent dialogue choices for everything else. Some people may say that this is just a natural evolution of how MiHoYo is writing the Traveler's character nowadays compared to 2 years ago, but hey, you know what's also a natural evolution of that? Giving the Traveler more voiced scenes. Doesn't have to be a lot, obviously, and they should still be reserved for the more important scenes in the story, but that would still be better than the Traveler showing up to a country, solving all its problems like they're in a flex tape commercial, saying no more than like 10 words, and then just leave. One more addition about quests before I forget. Remove the character overlap restriction for quests. If you've started a quest but haven't finished it, and you get another quest that involves the character from that other quest, you can't proceed with a new quest until you finish the previous quest completely. Take a shot every time that I said quest just now. This is rather annoying and pretty unnecessary. Genshin is the only game that has a quest mechanic kinda like this, if you can even call it a mechanic, most likely as a side effect of it being a 3D game. The biggest problem I have with this personally is that for character story or Archon quests, right, they oftentimes start on their own if you enter the vicinity where they're located, which means you can't choose to start them, which means you're forced to sit through an unskippable cutscene that you might have not wanted to watch in the first place because you weren't planning on doing that quest yet. This is made worse by the fact that as long as those quests are in your menu, even if you're not specifically navigating to them, their triggers are active, meaning that you can walk straight into one without knowing because the game doesn't tell you where those quests are on the map until you decide to navigate to it specifically. It would be one thing if you could always choose when to start a quest, but the fact that you can't, not for the more important quests at least, combined with this arbitrary character overlap restriction, I don't know what else to call it, that's just what I'm calling it for now, makes dealing with quests in Genshin feel very clunky. And again, it's not like Genshin's story is exactly top tier, at least not right now. Improve daily commissions, both in terms of their rewards and the commissions themselves. Right now, 1 day's worth of commissions gives you 60 Primo Gems, 40 from the commissions themselves, and 20 when you turn them into Catherine. Each multi-roll in Genshin, for perspective, costs 1600 Primo Gems, so it'll take you 27 days just from daily commissions alone to get enough for a single multi-roll, which means if you, as a free-to-play, have to hit hard pity at 9 multi-rolls at any point, that'll cost you about 8 months worth of Primo Gems from commissions. Obviously, that doesn't take into account the Primo Gems that you can get throughout the game from other sources, so in reality, it's not that slow, but that doesn't change the fact that multi-rolls in Genshin are very expensive, and with so many characters that people want to roll for and more on the way with future updates, increasing the rewards that daily commissions give out will alleviate the pressure that many players have when looking at a banner that they really want to roll on. MiHoYo did say that they're concerned with creating excessive anxiety in the player base, right? In fact, speaking of excessive anxiety, a good first step would be to remove the Primo Gem rewards from Abyss and integrate them into daily commissions instead, an idea that Zajev suggested in his own video regarding Genshin Endgame. Because every Abyss cycle lasts for about 2 weeks and clearing floors 9 through 12 gives you 600 Primos, distribute those Primos into daily commissions instead so that way 2 weeks worth of commissions is increased by 600 gems. This can be either in the form of direct commission rewards where they start giving more than the usual 10 each and then 20 from Catherine, or as a 2-week bonus, kind of like a stamp card, where every day that you complete and turn in your dailies, you get 1 stamp, and once you collect 2 weeks worth, you get an extra 600 Primos or something like that. So, not only would this incentivize players to log in and play Genshin every day more, but this would also eliminate that quote-unquote excessive anxiety that MiHoYo seems to be concerned with by making it so that players who can't or don't want to do Abyss every 2 weeks no longer feel like they're losing out on potential Primos just because they don't know life the game like some of us do. And as an extension of this, I'd like to see MiHoYo improve the monthly login system that they have on their website, because it's mostly useless outside of the 60 Primos that you get from it. Monthly login systems like this in other gacha games at least give you things that you can use, even if it's not a lot, but the monthly login on HoYoLab only gives a total of 60 Primos a month. And remember, that's how many Primos you get for doing a single day's worth of commissions, and it gives you nothing nothing else but trash for the rest of it. The daily commissions themselves should also see some improvement too. Some of them, like the Safe Conduct Escort mission, take a disproportionately longer time to complete compared to others, so a simple optimization like making the escort cargo travel faster while making enemies do more damage to it would be a lot more bearable. However, just to be clear, I'm not advocating for increasing the difficulty of the dailies since they're not meant to take a long time, and doing so may accidentally hurt players with less developed accounts, or if I'm being blunt here, the casual players. Another issue I have is with regional commissions, which are unique commissions that spawn only in specific regions, and each region has a number of these kinds of dailies. Right now, it is complete RNG whether you even get a regional commission at daily reset, and in many cases, you just don't. And when you do, you only get one, and it's completely random which one it is. For example, at the time of me writing the script for this video, I'm still stuck doing Liyue commissions because I have one last regional commission to do there, the Good Sign commission, and get the achievement associated with it. This means that not only do I need to pray that I get a regional commission, which isn't guaranteed to appear, but I also need to pray that it's the Good Sign daily specifically, which is only one out of a handful of unique dailies that could appear. Oh, and did I mention that even if you've already completed the other regional commissions and got the achievements for them, they still keep showing up anyway? And as the cherry on top, Good Sign has not one, but two achievements that it can give, because in it, you're supposed to help Zihua look for signs that might tell him that he can find a girlfriend, and the daily will spawn 2 random scenes for you to investigate out of 5 possible. So not only does this mean that you're forced to do Good Sign multiple times already just to get all the options, but since the daily can give you scenes that you've already investigated, you may have to get Good Sign even more times than usual depending on your luck. And the scenes themselves have 2 outcomes, one where you leave it alone and the other where you disrupt it, which is how you get both achievements, by both leaving and disrupting all the scenes that the daily can give you, minus the one that involves Granny Shan. Luckily, very recently, I was finally able to get the last scene that I needed to complete the Good Sign achievement, but because of this, in total, I've probably spent an entire year or even more just doing Liyue commissions, and I haven't even touched Sumeru commissions at all yet, even though Sumeru has been around for more than like half a year at this point. Like, yeah, I get it, achievements are supposed to be hard to get, and if I hate how they're set up this much, do I really need to bust my balls over some dumb achievement that only gives like 5 Primo Gems anyway when you finally get it? Probably not. But hey, it's part of the game's content, and since I'm one of those people who likes going for achievements, I'm gonna do it, and I'm far from the only person who does. It's just that achievements should be things that you can earn with your own ability, not by playing a goddamn lottery. I mean, we already do that enough as it is with the gacha itself. So, how would I improve this? The simplest way would just be to guarantee that each set of dailies that spawn every day has at least one regional commission, and make it possible to get more than one if you're lucky. Ideally, your Traveler's Handbook should list all of the possible unique commissions that each region has, tell you which ones you've completed, and give you the option to blacklist them so that they don't show up and deny a commission spot for one that you haven't done yet. That way, the commissions themselves don't need to be changed, and MiHoYo can keep designing them as they have been, but it also won't take months or even years for those of us who like going after achievements to do. Improve the weekly bounty system and rewards. Just like the dailies, the weeklies could use some improvement too, and here I'm talking specifically about the bounties that improve your regional reputation. The bounty fights themselves are pretty underwhelming. Dailies, I can understand them being easy, but the bounties themselves are nothing more than just glorified dailies with an extra combat condition attached to them that says that the boss enemy is immune to damage from a certain element, and that's it. So how I would make the bounties better is first by getting rid of the element restriction. Restrictions like that inherently make gameplay less interesting because it limits your options, and in a gacha game like Genshin, where different players will have access to different characters, if someone who relies on mainly Hydro DPSs, for example, gets a bounty with a Hydro restriction, then naturally they're going to be less motivated to do it. I actually don't know if you can reset a bounty if you get one with a restriction that you don't like, but even if you can, like I said, gameplay that limits your options will almost always be less interesting than gameplay that doesn't do this. So rather than restricting limiting the kinds of elements that you can use, I would rather see bounties offer bonus damage for using a specific element or reaction against the boss enemy. I would also make the bounty fights more intricate. Instead of just rushing into a Sumeru or Inazuma bounty and beating the crap out of the boss immediately, maybe you gotta fight a few groups of enemies first that give you intel to where the boss enemy is, kinda like how the Mondstadt and Liyue bounties do it, but with more combat so it doesn't feel as tedious, and the last fight against the boss itself is a longer one, with weaker enemies showing up first that you gotta clear out first, and the boss coming in last to fight you. Make sure the boss also doesn't die in like 5 seconds either. In addition, once you finish the reputation ladder and get all the rewards, the weekly bounties functionally become nothing more than an extra 90,000 Mora every week. Like, there should be a way to convert the extra rep that you get into something actually valuable, maybe like Primo Gems, for example? Or make it so that you no longer get reputation and instead get other rewards. Maybe after you clear the 3 bounties for the week, the bounty manager of each region offers you a choice between a couple of reward packages. For example, additional Mora, XP, Sanctifying Essence or Unctions, or Crystal Chunks. And no matter which package you take, you also get additional primos and friendship points or something. Oh, and don't forget to buff the rewards for doing the bounties themselves too. Sigil ladders should not be gated by story content. What I'm referring to here are things like the Sacred Sakura Tree in Inazuma, the Lumenstone Adjuvant in the Chasm, and Vanarana's Favor, or the Big Radish as I like to call it, in Sumeru. This is just a minor gripe, but I've always found story-locked or time-locked content to be annoying as hell to deal with in gacha games, and the way Genshin handles the sigil ladders for each region for me is no different. Like, you shouldn't be stopped from redeeming things you found from exploring new regions. It's Genshin. Like, exploration is half the fun you have in this game, or at least it's supposed to be, so what reason is there to prevent you from getting as many rewards as your sigils can get? Why do you have to wait for the entire region to come out first just to get everything? Sure, like, the crowns are really valuable, but what's the point in slowing down how fast people can get them when they're not even necessary to play Genshin in the first place? Optimize and improve the Serenity Pots. I don't use the Serenity Pot myself much, so I don't feel very qualified to give suggestions on how to improve it exactly, but what I do use it for is to collect realm currency and friendship points and exchange the realm currency for things in the shop, namely the transient resin and the weapon crystals. So what I can suggest is either lower the price of the items in the shop or increase both the realm currency cap and the rate at which your Serenity Pot accumulates that currency, or even both, and let players buy up to 5 extra transient resin or even fragile resin every week. Matter of fact, add fragile resin as an additional item that players can buy, and let them buy up to like 3 of them a week or something. I'll leave the suggestions for the base building aspect of the Serenity Pot to people who actually use it, but what I can say is, if even I'm annoyed by the fact that you can't just place as many of your characters in your Serenity Pot as you want, then there's definitely ways to improve it. Seriously, what the hell is the load limit even supposed to mean? Optimize and improve expeditions. Currently, expeditions are really underwhelming. You send out characters for 15 or 20 hours or so, and they come back with just a handful of materials, the most useful of which are crystal chunks for weapon ores. So the expeditions that have them as rewards are the main ones that people do, followed by the Mora ones, since everything else just gives food or flowers or something. The Sumeru expeditions don't even have any that give crystal chunks, and since you can only have up to 5 expeditions active at a time for now, there's just no point in doing them. Since expeditions are supposed to be just a side feature, I actually don't mind them being 20 hours long by default, but I do think that their rewards should be better than just giving a bunch of carrots or radishes or something like that. So expedition rewards should also include resources that are actually useful, like Mora, XP, Sanctifying Essence, Fragile Resin, or Primo Gems maybe? Improve the Parametric Transformer item. It's another weekly feature like the bounties, and it can give some decent rewards actually, if you remember to use it, that is. So there's only 2 suggestions that I have for it. Have the game inform you on your map that you can use your Parametric Transformer again when it's off cooldown, just like how your map gives you notifications on your expedition progress, forging progress, cooking progress, and others. And give players a filter that lets them select what kinds of rewards they want out of the Transformer, so it's not totally random. Now onto the real spicy topics, oh boy. Resin should be removed from the game starting off. Many gacha games have stamina systems. For example, the ones that I play that have them are FGO, Arknights, Genshin, and Blue Archive, and in Genshin it's called Resin. Stamina is how these gachas limit the progress of players by putting an artificial cap on how much they can play the game, which conveniently allows the developers or the publishers of these games to put in a system where players have the option of paying to refresh their stamina using premium currency, so the games can make more money, though usually these games also make sure to put in free-to-play friendly ways of refreshing stamina too. How Resin works in Genshin, if you're not already familiar with it, is this. Resin accumulates passively on your account at a rate of 1 Resin every 8 minutes, which caps out at a total of 160, at which point your account stops passively generating Resin until you spend some of it, and then it'll start stocking up Resin passively again. You use Resin mainly to farm materials that your characters need for their ascensions and gear, or in other words, to make progress on improving your account. But there are items called Fragile Resin and Transient Resin that give you 60 Resin apiece when you use them, so they're basically Resin on demand, with the difference being Transient Resin expiring after a week or two depending on when you bought it, so you can't hoard it like you can with Fragile Resin. The problem is that if you're a free-to-play, you don't get a lot of Fragile Resin or Transient Resin. You get a limited number of the fragile ones from leveling up your adventure rank, the sigil ladders, and the free battle pass, and you can only buy 1 transient resin from the Serenity Pot shop every week. Besides them, the only remaining way to refresh resin is to spend Primo Gems, and it goes like this. You can refresh resin with Primos up to only 6 times a day, and it jumps in price the more you do it. So it starts off at 50 Primos for the first refresh, then 100 for the next 2, and then 150 for the 4th, and then 200 for the rest. This means that max resin refreshing costs 800 Primo Gems a day. To put this in perspective, the most expensive pack is $100 US, or whatever your regional equivalent is, and it gets you just over 8,000 Primo Gems, assuming no double bonus. So, if you max out your resin refreshes, you're essentially paying almost $10 every day to farm for more materials, or $300 a month, or 3 $100 packs just to play the damn game more. In comparison, World of Warcraft, for example, which is a subscription-based game, will set you back just $15 a month, or cheaper if you sub for 3, 6, or more months at a time. And while I've never played it myself, I'm fairly certain that WoW lets you play for as long as you want and doesn't artificially lock your progress for the most part. Alright, so maybe some of you won't like that I'm comparing a subscription-based game like WoW to a free-to-play game like Genshin, so maybe League of Legends or Valorant are better examples. They're also free-to-play games that also have microtransactions, but not only are those microtransactions for things that are purely cosmetic, like character skins, but they also don't prohibit players from playing as much as they want and making as much progress on their accounts as they want. Now, gacha games are kinda their own thing, so they get to do shit that the rest of the video game industry desperately wishes they could get away with. Remember Diablo Immortal? Yeah, that was Blizzard trying to get on the gacha industry themselves, but they did it too early, and they did it to a franchise as exalted as Diablo, so of course they got shit for it. And it turned out to be a shitty game anyway, because most Western publishers don't know how to make a good gacha game in the first place. And at the end of the day, it's up to the player to decide if it's worth their money to pay for stuff they want in a gacha game. I get that. I mean, I should, given how many gachas I play and how long I've been playing them for. The fundamental difference between Genshin and almost every other gacha, however, is the fact that Genshin plays like a normal-ass game. It's a 3D open-world RPG. You can physically control your characters and move them around. You can control them directly yourself. Most gachas don't do this, and instead, their gameplay looks like this. While they can be fun in their own rights, obviously, they just don't compare to something like Genshin, which offers a fundamentally different experience. Most importantly, Genshin's combat on the surface is simple and smooth, which is perfect for a casual audience, but it's also one of those internet icebergs where the top of the Genshin one is surface level stuff, and everything below the waterline is stuff like elemental application levels, internal cooldowns, crit values, the Keking main's Discord server, 4-piece Thundering Fury Kazuha, Tectone spending over 10 grand on Staphoma's first raid up, and the total number of times Mtashed has said he's quitting Genshin. One of these things is artifact farming, which I'll rant about in more detail in just a bit, don't you worry. The fact that it's possible to hyper-optimize artifacts, which are a big part of your character's gear in Genshin, to make them as strong as your RNG will let them, combined with the potential for Genshin's content to be more diverse and challenging, clearly shows that MiHoYo intended for the game to be able to support such content. But just as clearly, that's not the case right now, is it? The only permanent endgame content we have is Abyss, basically, and it's been that way since the beginning of the game 2.5 years ago. So not only is paying for extra stamina in Genshin expensive, which is something only whales like me can do on a regular basis anyway, but there's not even any truly satisfactory content for those who want to do it to justify that price tag in the first place, and that's before the fact that the resin system is one that's designed to curb your progress and force you to commit to the game long term to see any meaningful progress on your characters and weapons. Oh, and those characters and weapons that I mentioned, yeah, you might have to pay for those because you can only get a lot of them from a goddamn gacha in the first place. At this point, some of you might be like, well, okay, tough shit, loser, ain't our problem if you decide to waste your own money just to keep playing a game for content that it doesn't even have, when you could just play the game for free and not have to worry about it. This is an understandable reaction for people who don't know any better, but let me just kindly remind you anyway that Genshin is a live service game, which means that it has to provide consistent updates with new content on a regular basis to keep people playing, content that takes money to develop, and well, I know for a fact that it ain't you broke-ass bitches paying for it. And even though Genshin makes most of its money from the gachas, I'm still willing to bet that it makes a decent amount from people buying packs to refresh resin every day, which makes it virtually impossible for the resin system to be removed, since like I said earlier, it turns a profit for MiHoYo for completely free. So unfortunately, they're not gonna get rid of the resin system like I suggested earlier, but at the same time, I don't see why MiHoYo shouldn't at least add some extra content for us to enjoy. Content that vindicates all the time, money, and effort we put into making our accounts go even further beyond. Actually, hold up, I do see why, and it's the fear that casuals have that they won't be able to do this sort of content like they can't do Abyss, something to do with like anxiety or whatever. I'll get to that later because I do have suggestions on how MiHoYo should handle putting in endgame content that should address that in ways where casual players won't miss out. So now that we've established how shitty the resin system is and why we still gotta deal with it, we have to come up with ways to improve it instead, and luckily I've got some suggestions for that too. Starting with the resin itself, I'd increase the resin cap again to 200, lower the timer for passive resin accumulation from 8 minutes per resin down to like 5 or 6 only, and decrease the cost of resin for domain rewards to 10 per run instead of 20. For resin refreshes, ideally people should be able to refresh as much as they want, which is how gachas like FGO or Arknights do it. If you refresh their stamina with premium currency, Saint Quartz in FGO or Urgenite Prime in Arknights, it completely restocks your stamina. Unlike resin, which only gives you, 60 resin per top up, each refresh also costs only 1 Saint Quartz or Urgenite Prime, and the biggest packs in those games give you either 167 Quartz for FGO or 185 Urgenite Prime for Arknights, meaning that if you buy a pack for nothing but farming, it will last you a really, really long time, or at least it should. On top of this, they also have their own versions of fragile or transient resin, apples in FGO, and sanity potions in Arknights, that refill different amounts of stamina depending on what type they are. And, hilariously, FGO even put in their own version of condensed resin called blue apples that work basically the exact same way, except you can make as many of them as you want. Basically, the idea with these games is that if players want to pay for it, they can control how fast they want to progress their accounts. So the best way to optimize resin refreshes for Genshin is to remove the current cap of 6 refreshes, set the price of refreshing with Primo Gems at a fixed rate that doesn't change no matter how many times you refresh, and have each refresh give 160 resin instead of the current 60. If this is way too much for MiHoYo to handle, then they have an alternate option with how other gachas like Blue Archive and Azure Lane do it, which is by setting a much higher cap of 20 refreshes a day for their stamina and starting the refreshing price off low, then incrementally increase them the more refreshes are used. Obviously, Genshin already does this, so all miHoYo needs to do is increase Genshin's max refresh cap to like 20 or something and revamp the prices so that the first 3 refreshes only cost, for example, 20 primos, and the next 3 cost 40, the next 3 cost 60, etc. And of course, make more fragile resin available for the player base so that the free-to-play players aren't left out. It's the reason why I kept suggesting that more of our rewards in Genshin from things like bounties and commissions give fragile resin so that free-to-play players can benefit from these changes too. For artifact domains specifically, change them so that you can choose which of the 2 artifact sets you want to farm for, either just for one of them or for both like how it is now. So that way you will only get artifacts for the set you chose if you only selected one. While the type of artifacts you get will still be random, make it so that you can fix which main stats you want in the circlets, cups, and timepieces, because oh my god, does it take so freaking long trying to look for a specific cup, especially if you want one that's in set for one of your characters. Also, add an item into the battle pass for both the free-to-play and paid sections that allows you to manipulate an artifact's substats in some way. In the closed beta for Honkai Star Rail, which is also developed by miHoYo, the battle pass for that game had an item that lets you fix the main stat for a particular artifact. So, I want to take that idea, improve it, and put it into Genshin too. How this item would change an artifact substats, I haven't exactly decided, since there can be lots of ways to do it. It could change one substat line into another of your choice while keeping any of the roles it already got, or it could rearrange substat roles into ones that you select, etc. Because these artifact domain changes would make farming artifacts a lot easier, I would also suggest to buff all artifact rarities by giving them one more possible substat role to incentivize further artifact optimization. So for example, a 5-star artifact's max enhancement goes up from plus 20 to plus 24. Plus, increase the chance for artifacts to start with the maximum number of substat lines so that it's more likely for you to get them instead of whatever their lower number is. Don't forget about the artifact strongbox either. Apply as many of the suggestions that I made that make sense to the strongbox too. Add equipment presets for characters so that you can transfer weapons and artifacts from one character to another with a single button. Not sure why Genshin still doesn't have this feature 2.5 years in, especially when Honkai Impact now does. Also, increase artifact inventory from 1500 to 2500 because, well, having all the characters in the game hold their own personal artifact sets and trying to have enough space for fodder to level up new ones is really annoying without extra space. Add more ways for players to obtain fragile resin. Like I mentioned earlier when I was ranting about how dumb the resin system is, you can only get so many fragile resins as a free-to-play, and even for whales like me, it takes a while to stock up on a big number of them. So add fragile resins into places like the Stardust or Star Glitter Shop, Serenity Pot Shop, event shops, and others. Just to list a few examples here, maybe when you do a full week's worth of daily commissions, Catherine throws in a bonus of a fragile resin for you or something. Add a resin fragment item of some kind that chests and other environmental interactables can drop, and you can use those to craft a full fragile resin. And when you go through Abyss, since we moved the Primo Gem rewards for clearing floors 9 through 12 over to daily commissions, they can then instead be replaced with fragile resin, 1 per floor. Speaking of which, let's talk endgame content, starting with Abyss. Other than the Primo Gem rewards being moved to dailies, Abyss rewards should be improved to make up for it. I already suggested fragile resin, but they could also include, more sanctifying essence, weapon crystals, XP, and of course, more Mora. Diversify Abyss content with different environments, scenarios, and clear conditions. Early Genshin Abyss actually handled this a little better in my opinion. Different stages were used as opposed to the single Abyss floor that we've been seeing for the past year or so, possibly even longer, and you had a fight where your team had to deal with the Dragonspine cold debuff, but there was a Pyrosealy floating around the stage, so the idea was you had to fight next to it and then move out if there were enemies out of range, and then come back to it when your cold debuff was getting too high. Abyss nowadays feels very homogeneous in its content, especially when miHoYo is on a mission to make us hate the Magu Kenki as much as we can. That's okay though, the Wenu is exactly what the Abyss needs for more diverse content, right? The easiest and simplest way that I can think of to make Abyss more fun and have more interesting fights is to include aspects of exploration into it, just like the Pyro-Sealy mechanic that I mentioned earlier, though maybe not that exact mechanic since most people, I take it, aren't big fans of Dragonspine's cold debuff. Putting tether points across the stage can encourage plunge attack strats for people who aren't Xiao mains. Incorporating the debuff and buff tiles that some domains have can emphasize better positioning, and placing one-time use elemental totems that have different effects upon activation depending on their element can influence team comps, among other examples. There should also be different cleared conditions instead of the usual, kill everything in less than 3 minutes objective that we usually have, like a survival objective, where you have to survive 3 minutes of rift hounds and other enemies attacking you, or an assassination objective where you wait for a target enemy to spawn specifically and kill them while enemies keep spawning to stop you. Currently, the only other clear condition we have is the objective defense one, where you have to keep the totem in the middle of the map safe and your rank depends on how much health it has left when you're done. So adding a few more of these objective types would keep the Abyss experience fresh and interesting. To encourage more players to try out Abyss, I think food buffs and co-op should be allowed in floors 9 through 12, and trial characters should be provided just like how they are for regular events. I mean, it's not exactly a secret that MiHoYo can sometimes handle Abyss cycles around what banners are active, like the recent Shenhe and Ayaka banner when the Wenu was the final boss of floor 12, or the Nahida banner going on right now during the Prism boss cycle. And because this would make floors 9 through 12 much easier for veterans, as if they had trouble with them these days anyway, more floors should be added where you can't use food buffs, play co-op, or use trial characters up to floor 16, for example. These 4 new floors should be even more difficult and feature not just elite bosses but also weekly bosses, since I think it's really weird that MiHoYo has never added a weekly boss to Abyss before, given how so much effort's gone into them. Floors 13 to 16 should not give any extra rewards other than maybe a special little title card or something purely cosmetic. Personally, I think it'd be really cool if players who have cleared floors 13 to 16 with 36 stars get a little special something, like I said, a special little cosmetic of some kind that they can put on their characters or their weapons or something. This way, casual and free-to-play players don't need to feel as pressured to do these higher floors for extra meaningful rewards, while veteran players can still do them for the extra prestige and that, unique cosmetic, whatever it turns out to be. Aside from Abyss, I would love to see more permanent game modes be added to Genshin. Over the years, MiHoYo's given us events with a wide variety of gameplay, so this shouldn't be out of their expertise at all. One suggestion that I have is an endless mode. You fight against an infinite number of enemy waves with randomized enemies, and they get more and more difficult until you either quit or your whole team gets taken out, and you basically see how long you last. Another is a boss rush mode, where you go fight through a gauntlet of elite and weekly bosses and see how fast you can go through it. One idea that I'm a particular fan of is a roguelike mode. In fact, Abyss is kind of already like a roguelike because you can choose a random buff at the start of each floor. This roguelike game mode should feature branching paths, a shop to spend currency, and unique mechanics that let you play the game in ways that you can't in a normal game. It should also have a unique set of bosses that only appear in this game mode, maybe even a secret boss or two. A good example to follow is the integrated strategies game mode in Arknights, because it has all of these features that I just mentioned. All of these extra game modes have the added potential of offering reward ladders of their own to incentivize people to play them, and they can reset their rewards every patch cycle just like the Battle Pass. I would go so far as to suggest a leaderboard for Abyss floors 13 to 16 too, but not only do I not know how this leaderboard would rank players exactly, but it might also be pretty controversial on its own, even if it didn't give any actual rewards. Improve Genshin's netcode and co-op experience, and add more co-op events, both combat and exploration. In addition to giving all those extra game modes that I suggested earlier co-op so you can play them with friends or even randoms via matchmaking, there should be more dedicated co-op events in Genshin, since the only major one that I remember us getting on a somewhat regular basis is the Windtrace event. Of course, these events should still have the option for people to play solo since, well, not everyone prefers playing with other people. Add extra permanent exploration modes. Since exploration is something that Genshin does very well, I think a separate exploration mode that that has unique maps or variations of existing locations would be really cool. They would have more difficult enemies and tougher puzzles, but they would also have more rewarding chests and give a Primo Gem completion bonus if you 100% it. The inspiration for this idea comes from the Lost Sector game mode in Nikke Goddess of Victory, where you lead a team or two of your units through a map, fight enemies, and figure out puzzles to make your way through and find all of the rewards. Add a dedicated training mode. Masanori in Inazuma is intended to be our training dummy, but a more fully fledged training mode will be a lot better for people who want to test different builds, different artifacts, or different teams in more detail. It should be like the training modes you find in fighting games, with the added feature of spawning either a proper training dummy or any overworld enemy that you want, and it should be co-op too, of course. This could even be an expansion for the Serenity Pot, which would be convenient since it already supports co-op natively. A smaller issue here, but I've always found the party setup screen to be a little awkward, with everyone just kind of standing around in the default idle pose and just, staring at you, because the kind of party setup screen that I'm used to seeing is a lineup of character art like what you'd see in other gacha games like FGO, Girls Frontline, Arknights, and Nikke. Initially, I thought that this was just a side effect of Genshin being a 3D game, as in it uses 3D models instead of dedicated character art to represent the characters in your party setup screen. But then I realized that Blue Archive also uses 3D models for its combat and party setup screen too, and there the character models all have their own unique idle poses. So if a much smaller game like Blue Archive can do it, surely it can't be that hard for MiHoYo to add in this extra detail for Genshin too. Implement a free-to-play way for characters to reach level 100. My first gacha game is Fate Grand Order, and in that game, there is a rare item called a Holy Grail that lets you limit break a character's level. Characters have different max level caps depending on their rarity, so 4-star characters, for example, can only go up to level 80, while only 5 stars can go up to 90. Holy Grails equalize the playing field by letting you level any character you want to level 100. The lower rarity characters do need more Holy Grails to get there, but the important thing is that they can if you really want them to. And as of a recent update, the max level cap for any Grailed character was actually raised to 120, making them even stronger. This sort of limit-breaking system makes perfect sense to me. Gacha games put a lot of emphasis on character designs because the characters are what they're putting into their gachas and making money off of. And naturally, players will have their favorites among the playable characters, so implementing a system like what I just described will, to be blunt, let everyone be able to simp for their favorite characters even more. Sure, some people will do this purely for gameplay reasons, but that's just a natural side effect of systems like this. The point is that a limit-breaking system that all players can access would make the game more interesting and make players more invested into their accounts and keep playing. That and, well, the enemies in Abyss can hit level 100, so why can't our characters do the same? As an extension of this, crowns should be added at a faster rate than they are now. Currently, the only way to get crowns are from the Frostbearing Tree in Dragonspine, the Sacred Sakura Tree in Inazuma, the Lumen Stone in Chasm, the Tree of Dreams in Sumeru, and limited time major events that most patch cycles have. The problem with major events giving crowns is that there's only one major event per patch, or in other words, one crown every 6 weeks, so getting them from events can take a long time. And since these events are limited time, newer players can't just go back in time to get those crowns that they missed out on, so they can only rely on the ones that you get from the sigil ladders that I mentioned before, which kinda sucks when you consider that out of the total 33 crowns that Genshin has made available so far in the past 2.5 years, we've gotten almost twice as many from all the events we've had so far compared to how many are available as permanent content. To be fair, Genshin isn't the type of game where you have to use crowns. A geared national team with SL9s on the relevant talents should be able to crush most Abyss cycles, and of course you don't even need to spend crowns on irrelevant talents like normal attack talents for characters who only use their skill and ults, so you can save some crowns there. But at the same time, more crowns in the game means that not only will newer players be able to catch up a little faster to veterans who've been playing Genshin for the past 2 years, but also older players can more freely distribute crowns to other characters. Combine this with the artifact farming quality of life changes that I suggested earlier, and people will be encouraged to branch out more and build more diverse teams instead of just, running national variants all day due to the investment levels that other characters may need to justify being used in the first place. To be clear, I don't want there to be a way for people to pay for crowns. You should still only be able to get them if you actually play the game. But again, crowns shouldn't be so rare and locked behind limited time events as they are now, especially when you consider that right now, with the absence of any limit-breaking system that I talked about earlier, they're the only way to easily show people which characters are your favorite. Add a way to transform older weekly boss materials into newer ones. This is a more specific complaint, but for example, I have a ton of older weekly boss materials from farming, Dvalin, Andreas, Boss Tartaglia, and others because I was mainly going for dream solvents back when they were first put into the game. Mind you, this is after I leveled all my characters' talents to at least 9, and it's not like I can use them by, crowning older characters, since as we just discussed, we just don't even get enough crowns in the first place for me to consider doing that. And the only reason why I still have characters who don't have level 9 talents yet is because we physically haven't had the newer bosses long enough for me to farm enough materials from them to level them all. So, having a way to convert older weekly mats into newer ones using, dream solvents or something would let me actually use them. This will also encourage people to farm more of the weekly bosses since they can level up the skills for newer characters faster. Weekly boss materials take a long time to accumulate since you only get 2 a week. Maybe 3 if you're lucky. Each weekly boss gives different materials, and characters need 4 weekly materials to go from SL6 to SL9 for each talent, and another 2 on top of that if you want to crown it. So it takes a minimum of 3 weeks to crown just one of a character's talents if you didn't already have a stash of weekly mats for them. They should also be extended to weapon essential materials and talent books, as in if you have a bunch of older weapon mats or talent books that you don't think you'll ever use, there should be a way for you to transform them into more recent materials, so that way you can actually use them rather than, watch them collect dust for God knows how long. Maybe this can be an additional functionality for the parametric transformer? I don't know. Just tossing out ideas here. Expand the free 4-star pick to all regions, not just Liyue. Currently, the only event that lets you pick a copy of any 4-star character for free is Lantern Rite, but it's limited to just Liyue characters. Now, we have had events before that gave out free 4-stars who weren't Liyue, like Fischl and Kole, and I understand that, Genshin is made by a Chinese developer and is naturally huge in mainland China, so obviously they're going to be biased towards Lantern Rite, which is supposed to be Genshin's version of Chinese New Year. But I still think that Genshin should have another major regional event that also lets players get a free copy of any 4-star character from that region. So 2 events a year that give a free 4-star that you can pick. Lantern Rite should still be a recurring event, and the second event can rotate between the other regions. And as we get more regions, maybe miHoYo can add a 3rd event that lets you pick a free 4-star of your choice. Along the same vein, I would suggest Anniversary to give all players a free 5-star ticket or item that can be exchanged for any one permanent 5-star character. We all know the memes and the controversies surrounding Genshin's Anniversary, at least its first one, especially here in NA, so something like a free 5-star ticket would be a good first step in repairing that reputation, especially when there are some people who've been, playing Genshin for the past 2 years, and they still don't have a certain permanent 5-star that they'd really like to have. And hey, people won't bitch about Dehya as much if they can at least get it for free. And if a free perma 5-star ticket is too much for miHoYo, then it should at least let people pick a perma 5-star weapon, which should include Hunter's Path and Beacon because, hey, how else is miHoYo gonna rerun them? On the topic of weapons, there should be a way to get old welfare weapons for newer players. What I'm referring to are weapons like Festering Desire, Windbloom Ode, Mailed Flower, Dodoko Tails, and Missive Windspear, which are all 4-star weapons that you could get R5 for completely free from some limited time events as long as you played them. But just like the crowns, if you missed the events or you weren't playing Genshin at the time, then there's just no way for you to be able to get them now. Even worse, MiHoYo seems to have something against reruns in Genshin, which is weird because every gacha does reruns. Even if they don't call it a rerun, they put in older content either permanently or for a limited time so that newer players have a chance to play them and access content that they missed out on from the first time. With this in mind, old welfare weapons should be brought back in future events wherever appropriate. So for example, if there is a future event with Klee as a major character, MiHoYo can bring back Dodoko Tails and put it and its refinements into that event's shop. I don't know how you guys would feel about these weapons being added to something like Star Glitter or Star Dust shop, so I won't push for that too hard. And finally, mods. It feels like taboo talking about mods in Genshin, no thanks to MiHoYo having a reputation for allegedly banning people who use them, but even still, someone's gotta vouch for them. Mods make any game more enjoyable for people to play if they want to go out of their way to install them, and keep people interested in a game if they're starting to get tired or bored of the base game, which is especially relevant for Genshin because by this point, 2.5 years in, there's quite a number of players who've stopped playing for a variety of reasons. I get that companies don't like it when random people on the internet modify their games to their own liking, since oftentimes the shit they put in can be offensive or give other people the wrong idea about their games. But it's the internet, man. You can't stop everyone from modding your game. And eventually someone, somewhere, who's bored enough and has enough time on their hands will make a mod for it and put it on the internet, and people will find out about it and try it out themselves, and Genshin is no exception. A company that handles the modding issue well is Capcom. A lot of their games, especially the Resident Evil games, since the remakes are all on PC, can be modded, and with how popular they've been, naturally there's a lot of mods for them. Hell, people are even pumping out mods for UMVC 3. There's basically no chance that a Marvel vs. Capcom 4 is ever going to come out soon, so MVC fans said fine, we'll do it ourselves. And these mods both keep people who are still grinding out the game playing, and brings back older players who are interested in trying out these new mods because they put a fun new twist on the game that they remember. It can even bring in new players who look at these mods and go, hey, that seems like fun, I want to try that. And rather than actively suppressing these modding scenes, Capcom just leaves them alone. In fact, they don't even acknowledge any modding that their fans do to their games, because they know if they start making a big deal out of it by going after them or something, they're only bringing more attention to the fact that these mods exist, which might have been what they didn't want in the first place. Like, how many of you guys found out that Genshin even had mods in the first place because you heard other people talk about how, oh, MiHoYo was apparently banning players because they were playing Genshin with mods? So preferably, I'd like MiHoYo to follow in Capcom's footsteps, where they leave modders and people using mods alone, but just don't talk about it. But because they have the whole Genshin content creator program, they can take this one step further and say that, you know, any streamer or YouTuber that's on the program can't use mods. Everyone else, though, should be able to play the game with mods without worrying about, you know, getting the ban hammer. Alright, let's close out with a few improvements to the gacha itself and other miscellaneous points of interest. Trial characters should be allowed in the overworld for a limited time, not just in the trial domain, so that people can get a better understanding of the character and make a more informed judgment on whether they want to roll for them or not. This can be done with a trial ticket or some other kind of item that can be redeemed for only one character out of the ones that you can try out during any given banner. When you use the ticket on a character, if you don't already have them of course, then they'll be added to your account for a limited time, a couple days for example, and you can use them as if you had them. Whether you can swap out their weapons and artifacts is up to MiHoYo. Reduce the price of packs, increase the value of packs, or lower the cost of gacha rolls. This is a near impossible request because why would MiHoYo willingly cut their own profit margins just because a nerd on the internet told them to? But hey, at the same time, just because I play 7 gacha games at the same time on stream, 8 when Star Rail comes out, doesn't mean that I ever like paying $100 just to watch 5 purple flashes on my gacha screen. The packs should be $80 or lower in my opinion, and the amount of primos they give should be a little higher too, maybe 9,000 primo gems if they keep the multi-roll cost at 1,600, so that way they give a little more than 5.5 multis per pack. For perspective, this is the value you get out of the most expensive packs for FGO, Blue Archive, and Arc Knights. Even better, the single roll cost should be lowered to something like 120 primos, so that way free-to-play players and thus everyone can benefit. Since this is the internet and someone is bound to ask, "What the hell, man? Why do you want MiHoYo to make less money? They're a company, they gotta make money too. How else are they gonna pay for future updates or some shit?" Let me address that too. I don't feel particularly concerned with MiHoYo's financial situation, because if they signed a deal with Ufotable to make a Genshin anime, they've got some pretty deep pockets because idiots like me continue to drop dozens of Benjamins gambling for pixels. And they can easily make up for the revenue that they lose out on by lowering gacha costs by ramping up their merchandise sales. Azure Lane, for example, doesn't make a whole lot of money from their gacha itself because they have the most generous gacha system I've ever seen, but they make up for it by going really hard on other avenues of income, like merchandise, merch collabs, and in-game skins. MiHoYo can do the same and promote their merch to the player base better, and as long as the quality of their products and their logistics are good, this should be an easy moneymaker for them. Oh, and maybe don't fuck up another 5-star like Dehya next time. I know MiHoYo already does this to an extent, but I'd like to see them do live events and merch collabs out here in the West outside of just, anime conventions or whatever. And I'd also like to see them put more effort into Genshin skins, which is a perfect segue into my next topic. Get rid of Genesis crystals and let skins be bought with Primo Gems. Genesis crystals exist solely to deny free-to-plays the ability to buy skins for free. Like, that's literally their only purpose in this game. And I don't know about you, but I think that's bullshit. Sure, some skins can be acquired for free anyways, as long as you play the events that give them out, but again, what if you weren't playing back then, or you missed the event? What if you are free to play, and you wanted to buy one of the premium skins, but you couldn't since there's no way to convert primos back into Genesis crystals? That sounds awful, doesn't it? Now go fuck yourself, because you can't unless you pay, is basically what MiHoYo is telling them. Yeah, no, that's a load of horse shit. Free-to-plays should be able to decide whether they want to buy skins if they can afford it too. And MiHoYo should add skins more frequently. It's been 2.5 years and we only have, 6 or 7 skins out of a total of 40 or 50 characters or something like that. It's basically free money that they're leaving on the table, not making more costumes than they are. And I don't care if the reason why they're so slow turning out skins because, they're trying to make them lore friendly or something, because if that's really the reason, they'd put some actual dark skinned characters in the game. Yeah, I fucking said it. Last thing about the costumes, for the base skin and any additional costumes that characters might have, there should also be a sort of modular customization system that lets players more intricately customize how their characters look. This will give them another way to express themselves and make it a little less confusing when you see, 2 or 3 of the same character running around together in co-op. So, for example, my favorite character is Mona, but I'm also a big fan of long hair. I would love to customize my Mona so that she has her hair down instead of being up in twin tails, and while her big ass hat is cool, sometimes I just want to see her run around without it. Hell, if I had the option, I'd even give the colors on her censored outfit to her uncensored one because I think they pop out better. And I'm sure you guys, too, have little customization ideas that you want to make on your own favorite characters as well. And speaking of customization options, I also want there to be an individual language toggle in the game, or in other words, a feature that lets you pick which language each individual character speaks in. Genshin currently has 4 different language dubs, but you can only have one of those dubs enabled at a time, even if you have all of them downloaded. I'll use Mona as an example here again. Even though I play with Japanese voices mainly, I actually like Mona's English dub quite a bit, and some others too, so I wouldn't mind having them set on English, but I don't want to have to switch entirely over to the English dub just to do that. Again, for some perspective, 2 other gacha games that I play that also offer multiple language dubs are Nikke and Arknights. Nikke has English, Japanese, and Korean, while Arknights has English, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese, just like Genshin. However, only Arknights gives you the option to pick what language each character speaks in-game individually. It's even put in a specific regional dialect for some Chinese characters like Ling.
没错，他研学思寇中的虽，即是俺们也是他。这倒是没有啥好藏掖的，我也不担心您所担心的。毕竟我就是我，死了也就是死了。就可惜了这杯中物跟这天地，我终究是喜欢的。
That's understandable, since Arknights is also made by Chinese devs, but they didn't need to give some characters an Italian dub just for one of their events, and yet they did.
Ti proteggerò io, Doc. Non si tratta solo della missione. Ogni nostra riunione è un momento di cui fare tesoro. Che effetto fa tornare a Siracusa? È indifferente. Qui comandano la mafia e le famiglie, non io. Ho deciso di rimanere solo perché devo sistemare i miei affari una volta per tutte. Fatto ciò, tornerò a Lungmen per ritrovare i miei amici.
And for the record, Arknights is the only gacha game that I know of that has an Italian dub of some kind. So it'd be cool if MiHoYo actually picked up on this and gave us the same feature too. Like, I'm not a programmer or anything, but I can't imagine this being that hard to do. Like, Genshin launched with multiple voices, whereas Arknights initially came out with only a Japanese voiceover, and then they started adding other languages like 2 or 3 years after they launched. So if they can pull it off, then so can MiHoYo. Allow Epitomized Path or the Weapon Pity to persist across banners just like Character Pity. This one's pretty self-explanatory. I don't see why people shouldn't be able to save up pity if they're able to for weapons as well. Since, you know, it's bad enough that Weapon Gacha can give you 3 different types of 5-star weapons, at least for your first one, and just having a more lenient, soft, and hard pity than Character Gacha, in my opinion, isn't quite enough. In addition, some people might only be interested in a 4-star character rather than the 5-star on a raid up, so let there be some kind of 4-star pity system, where you can be guaranteed a copy of a 4-star if you roll enough without getting them. And finally, just a minor suggestion here at the end, but add permanent 5-star characters and 5 and 4-star weapons to the monthly Star Glitter rotation. I'm not saying to replace the 2 4-star character rotations that already exist, since they're the only way for many players, myself included, to get extra copies of Kea, Lisa, and Amber, but instead add 3 more slots, one that rotates between different perma 5-star characters, one that rotates between different perma 5-star weapons, and one that rotates between different 4-star weapons. The 4-star weapons specifically should also include limited 4-star gacha weapons, like Xephos' Moonlight, so people can pick up another copy without having to pray for another raid up. And that's about all I got. Hopefully that covers a lot of things that the community also wants to be improved too. Of course, since I'm just one guy, there's bound to be stuff that I couldn't cover because either I forgot about them or I just didn't think of them. So if you felt like I missed anything, feel free to share it down in the comments below, and let me know if you agree or disagree with anything I've said here. Again, let me stress that despite what I might have sounded like in this video, my intention here isn't to demand that MiHoYo listen to me or anything I've said so far, just that they consider some of the things that either I or others in the community think should be improved with Genshin to make it an overall better game. And with that, that's it for me. Subscribe to the channel for more hour-long videos about Genshin or other gachas, and follow me on Twitch to watch me play 7 or 8 gachas all at once if you also have a crippling addiction to big titty anime girls and gacha games like I do. Peace.